So that noise that we just heard on the camera was a great blue heron. All the herons make these really outlandish croaks. They look and sound like dinosaurs. So if you need any more convincing that birds are indeed dinosaurs, go back and look at the evolutionary history, that's where our birds come from. Herons and egrets really showcase that perfectly. They just look like giant prehistoric animals. So that loud croaking groan call that we just heard was a great blue heron flying around. So the reason we stopped here and we were treated with that heron was to take a look at the swallows that are flying around. This is one of the few birds that we can easily see flying around this time of year. We're in between the nesting season and really just starting migration, so it can be deceivingly quiet out here right now, aside from all of the cicadas and other insects that we're hearing. But the swallows are really active. And so if you take a look at the water here, you'll see more and more swallows flying around, grabbing insects off the water surface. The species that we're seeing here right now is northern rough-winged swallow. These are relatively easy to identify, and we can contrast them with the other swallow species that we might know. The ones that you're probably most familiar with are tree swallow and barn swallow. Tree swallow is that species that has the bright metallic blue backs on the males, and we often see those in bluebird boxes. So they like to nest at that, 1.5 meters, 2 meter height. And we see them in farm fields and at water's edges. But these northern rough-winged swallows we often find near streams and rivers, and they nest in the banks. They nest lower towards the ground, and so often on these mud banks we find them nesting underneath bridges, very low, small bridges, as well as in tailpipes of abandoned cars and other structures sort of left abandoned. We can identify them from some of the other swallow species by their body shape. So color is helpful. All the birds have like a dark brown, pale brown, like a slatey brown back and a contrasting white belly. But the juveniles of species like tree swallows can also look like that, and cliff swallows as well. The northern rough-winged swallows, though, their body shape is really unique. They have these short little tails, and they also have a relatively small head. I call them tiny-headed. Their heads just look small in proportion to their body. Southern rough-winged swallow, which we don't have here, it's a species that you find in South America, and it looks almost identical, has even smaller head. They look comic, like they were, their heads were shrunken by some sort of mystical wizard. But northern rough-winged swallows are pretty common and widespread throughout Ohio, and now is a great time to see them in summer, and late in the summer as they're sort of flying around and catching insects on the water's edge. We saw, right before we started filming, we saw American goldfinch fly by. American goldfinch, this is one to really watch. As we mentioned earlier, they're becoming really active right now because they nest so late in the summer. And their flight calls are really fun to watch. Goldfinches have this sort of flittering and undulating flight pattern, and every time they reach the bottom of that flight, they utter a call, that chicory or potato chip call that seems to propel them back up into the sky. So if you see goldfinches flying overhead, you'll see this chicory flight as they go by. They can be a lot of fun to watch. So here we have on this snag hanging over the water a nice contrast between multiple swallow species. So the bulk of these are actually tree swallows. And right in the middle we see a couple adults, and on that tuft of straw there's a adult male looking at us. So he's got that nice bright metallic blue feathering. Oh, there they go. So what we're hearing right now is a family of white-breasted nuthatches. This is a common year-round bird in this part of Ohio. Late in the summer, these family groups will stick together, and you'll often hear multiple white-breasted nuthatches calling. Earlier I talked about this being a good eruption year for red-breasted nuthatch, which is a rare breeder in Ohio and much more common in Boreal Canada. Their calls are much more nasal and uniform. So I'm going to play. So red-breasted nuthatch, slightly higher pitch, more nasal, and more uniformly repetitive. So we'll often hear these sort of continuous series of toots. That and I just heard my first for the year, and it's very early. So this is going to be a good eruption year. Just a couple days ago. And I'm hearing and seeing reports of red-breasted nuthatches throughout the state. And so we're expecting this to be a really big year for eruption of red-breasted nuthatches, and it'll be interesting to see if there are other species that erupt as well. So we have a few species that we can find in Ohio only during the winter that are northern breeders, but can be eruptive based on food availability and weather patterns. Crossbills and other finches are another one. And so this could be a good year for them as well. It'll be interesting to see how they're related. Okay, northern flicker just flew in at the top of that snag on the left. So common woodpecker for Ohio. Unlike a lot of the other woodpeckers that you may be familiar with. And this is a male, and we know that because this bird has a mustache. The males, unlike the females, have this black stripe that comes down the side of their face. It looks like this giant mustache. The females don't have that. What sticks out on them, you can see right, that big bold white spot on their rump. That is usually easy to see as they fly off. Unlike other woodpeckers, flickers get a lot of their food from ants. So they forage on the ground, they probe in the ground for ants. And often, if you scare up a flicker as you're walking down a trail, you'll see that bright white patch fly off away from you. So we see them feeding more on the ground than we do in trees, but like all the other woodpeckers, they are cavity nesters.
Cool.
Belted kingfisher just called for us. And here we've got a few Carolina wrens making that puttering aggression call. There's a bird singing over here. So we've got a few birds flying in, and they'll probably come right up to us and continue to call and chatter. There's 3 or 4 Carolina wrens here, so most likely a family group. So the young stick together for a while, and these family groups move together. Very vocal birds. Pretty entertaining to watch. White-breasted nuthatch just flew to the snag. Cool thing about nuthatches is that they'll actually walk down the tree head first. Lots of really nice cavities and snags here for these birds. So we've got lots of cavity nesting species that we've seen so far. Carolina wrens, the white-breasted nuthatch, the northern flicker, the swallows. So we could even have the ruffling swallows, and the tree swallows especially would nest all throughout this snag. They really like these areas.